everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the first 2024 edition of our International Lending webinar with CEPR and Kiel. Happy New Year to everybody. Today we have a wonderful privilege of welcoming Barry Eichengreen to the webinar. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Barry does not need any introduction, so I'll just say that he's probably the best known, almost well-published economic historian of our time, and it's wonderful to have him and give him see his presentation on living with high public debt, which he presented at the Jackson Hole meetings last year, and that were much discussed and much debated. I haven't seen the paper or seen the paper presented, so I'm very much looking forward to it myself. And so are many in the audience. We have already 110 people joining, so wonderful event. Thank you so much. With no further ado, we'll have 45 minutes of presentation and then 15 minutes of Q&A. And people can raise questions after your presentation, so you basically have time to just give your talk. Thank you so much again, and welcome.
Thank you, Christoph. You can see the presentation?
Yes.
Good. So that there are 115 people in the audience testifies to the scope of this high-quality webinar that you and CEPR have put together, and I'm grateful that you've done so and for the invitation. As you mentioned, the paper that I will talk about today was originally prepared for the Fed's Jackson Hole symposium 4 months ago. It is co-authored with Serkan Arslanalp, who's at the IMF. This, of course, is not IMF policy or official doctrine by any means, and I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that the paper draws on a book that came out about a year and a half ago, co-authored with Asma El-Ghanani, Rui Estevez, and Chris Mitchner. Because this is a Jackson Hole paper, it is framed as a sweeping survey. It seeks to draw generalizations. Some will say that it over-generalize is my plan, therefore is to add a little bit of country-specific analysis that is not in the paper itself toward the end of the presentation this morning. So public debts have risen for reasons both good and bad, as everyone here will know. Good in that governments have financed needed responses to macroeconomic, financial, and public health emergencies. Bad in that they, in some cases, have borrowed imprudently and failed to retire those debts in good times. So the result has been increases in debt ratios worldwide, on average from 40 to 60%, as I show you here. So I will show you a series of figures organized in the same way, with debt as a percent of GDP, unweighted across countries. So the unweighted part is important. If this was simply global debt divided by global GDP, the figure would look differently, with a heavier weight on certain relatively heavily indebted large countries. But we thought it was important to analyze the situation of countries large and small alike, and that this presentation with the black line and the left-hand side vertical axis was more informative than the alternative. And on the right-hand side, we have the decomposition of that debt by holder, domestic banks, foreign banks, domestic non-banks, foreign non-banks, etc., so that it will be possible to see how that composition changes over time. So compositional changes are not especially prominent if we look at the world as a whole, but they become prominent when we look at different subsets of countries later on. So you can see from the left-hand side axis the recent post-global financial crisis rise in debt to GDP ratios toward 60% worldwide. In the advanced countries, which I show you in the next figure, you can see the rise in debt to GDP to nearly 85%, unweighted across this set of countries. And in my country, the United States, you can see that federal government debt has risen again. Train your eye on the left-hand side vertical axis to something on the order of 120% of GDP. So that 120% figure includes debt that the government in some sense owes to itself, that's held in the Social Security Trust Fund, etc. If you focus only on debt in the hands of the public, that ratio goes down to more like 100% of GDP, but the trend obviously remains the same. So this rise in debt ratios worldwide affecting advanced countries and emerging markets and developing countries alike has led a variety of anxious observers, including those at the BIS and the IMF, and I hazard to guess some amongst the audience of this webinar urgently to call for debt reduction. The message in the paper is that said debt reduction, while desirable in principle, is unlikely to occur in practice. It's unlikely to occur in practice for 5 reasons. Number one, large, persistent primary budget surpluses are simply not in the political cards. Primary budget surpluses achieved through a combination of tax increases and spending reductions will be difficult to sustain on a scale and for the duration needed to significantly reduce debt ratios on the scale and for the duration necessary to bring them down to pre-global financial crisis levels. For example, historically, as we show in the paper, countries have been able to sustain large primary surpluses for extended periods only when there exists political solidarity at the national level and only when economic growth is strong. The World Bank and others project slowing global growth going forward. Meanwhile, political divisions are pervasive. In a wide variety of countries, political polarization is rising. So I can show you in the next figure the varieties of democracy measure of political polarization in the United States as an example, but we would see the same thing for a variety of other countries. So given the troubled outlook for political solidarity, if you will, and the troubled outlook for economic growth, my co-author and I are skeptical about scope for sustaining large primary surpluses over time. And I'll come back to that in a couple of specific country cases toward the end. Second, it's difficult to imagine more favorable interest rate growth rate differentials, more favorable snowball effects. Interest rate growth rate differentials have become more favorable in recent years. So the version of this differential I show you here is courtesy of the Bank for International Settlements, and it shows the well-known tendency for R-G to fall over the last 3 or 4 decades or so. We know that real interest rates have trended downward over time. This is the secular stagnation phenomenon, trended downward to very low levels. And in my view, it's hard to foresee them falling still lower. My guess, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, is that real interest rates may now settle at levels very modestly higher than they were before the pandemic. That's only a guess, but again, it's a guess that's fleshed out a bit in the paper. Faster global growth is pleasant to imagine, but difficult to achieve. History suggests that the reorganization that firms are required to undertake in order to capitalize on new technologies, new general purpose technologies like generative AI, in ways that translate into faster productivity and aggregate growth. That reorganization takes time. There's an interesting discussion to be had here. It's not exactly my expertise, but that won't stop me about whether generative adaptation to generative AI and the resulting increase in productivity growth will be faster than in the cases of say, electrification or the personal computer. But I think there's no disputing the fact that there is a lag between development of a new technology and its exploitation that we have to recognize. So it's conceivable that a very large adverse shock to R minus G could shock governments out of their complacency, drive home the urgency of consolidation, prompt more ambitious adjustments. The fact that several of the large sustained fiscal adjustments we have seen in the last decade, Greece, for example, Iceland, for example, were in countries experiencing large shocks to R minus G, fiscal crises, if you will. That observation is consistent with this view. It is true that large adverse R minus G shocks may prompt additional fiscal adjustment to prevent debt ratios from exploding. My co-author and I are skeptical on the basis of our analysis of the historical record that impending changes in R minus G will be large enough that they will be of a magnitude sufficient to bring debt ratios significantly below current levels, given the political barriers to a more vigorous response. Third, inflation is not a sustainable route to reducing public debts. Only unanticipated inflation has this effect, and we saw that, in fact, in 2021 and into 2022, that a largely unexpected burst of inflation, a burst of inflation seemingly unexpected by financial markets, did succeed in significantly reducing debt ratios in a variety of countries. But even if unanticipated increase in inflation can reduce debt ratios in the short run by raising the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio, in the longer run, it's apt to raise interest rates and shorten maturities. At both horizons, we find, my co-author and I find, that inflation is unlikely to be economically important. We estimate some impulse responses in the paper, looking at the impact on the debt ratio in the United States of temporary or permanent inflation shock. And while there is some effect on the basis of the historical data and impulse responses, that effect is small by the standards of the problem. Fourth, statutory ceilings on interest rates and related measures of financial repression are less feasible now than they were in the past. Investors opposed to the widespread application of repressive policies are a more powerful lobby. Financial liberalization, internal and external, I would argue, is economic fact of life. The genie of financial liberalization is out of the bottle, and it's going to be difficult to put it back in. Fifth, and finally, debt restructuring in developing countries has become more challenging with emergence of official creditors who are not party to the Paris Club. Yes, we are talking about China, and with the growing importance of market finance, meaning that there are more creditors and more competing interests than in the once upon a time world, the good old world of official bilateral finance. I would suggest that some steps can be taken on the margin to improve this situation, to facilitate debt restructuring where debt restructuring is a desirable way out. More pressure can be applied to Beijing to accept Paris Club norms, if not Paris Club membership. More countries can follow the examples of the United Kingdom and Belgium by adopting anti-vulture fund legislation, which makes it harder for holdout creditors to enforce their claims in the courts. But these are still relatively modest, marginal changes. My co-author and I, in fact, disagree a little bit on this point. He's more optimistic about scope for restructuring under current or marginally improved institutions than I am. But there you have it. So all of this is to say these are 5 reasons why I would conclude that the obvious avenues to rapidly reducing current public debt burdens are effectively foreclosed, and we are going to have to think about how to live with chronic high public debts. These high debts are more of a problem for some countries than others, obviously. They're more of a problem for emerging markets and developing countries, in some sense, than they are for the major advanced economies. Debt ratios in the advanced economies are higher, but at the same time, there exists a robust demand for high-quality public label securities that only advanced country governments can provide. And there exists a robust demand for those securities from emerging markets in particular. So the next slide shows you 2 measures, a narrow definition and a broad definition. You can see the governments that are included here as AAA rated or equivalent, and their public label securities available to the rest of the world. Demand for those securities comes not only from emerging market central banks, which hold the AAA rated bonds of the United States and other advanced countries as reserves, but it also comes from the private sector. There's very considerable preoccupation with U.S. Treasury tick data when they come out every month. Commentators agonize over whether foreign central banks have added to or trimmed their holdings of U.S. Treasury securities, whether or not they have replaced those Treasury securities with U.S. agency securities. In the paper, in contrast, we highlight also the existence of robust private sector demand, and private sector demand for these investment grade public label securities of the United States and other advanced countries is as large. It's of the same order of magnitude as foreign official demand. So private financial institutions in the rest of the world hold safe assets like U.S. Treasuries as capital and reserves. Investors hold them because they are free of adverse selection problems. Individuals hold them again as insurance against idiosyncratic shocks. Emerging market governments themselves have limited capacity to produce safe assets. So this demand is satisfied by the governments of advanced countries, like that of the United States. And this structural source of demand from the foreign private as well as official sector suggests that the public debts of advanced country governments, they may not be optimal, but they are at least manageable in most cases. Looking forward, there are nevertheless some rather daunting challenges. Given aging populations, governments will have to find additional finance for healthcare and pensions. They will have to finance more spending on defense, on climate change abatement and adaptation, on the digital transition. And we know that a substantial number, depending on who you how you define debt distress, a substantial number of low-income countries, by one measure, as many as 60, are in debt distress. So living with high public debt means, therefore, avoiding steps that make a bad situation worse. It means minimizing unproductive public spending. It means targeting social transfers as a way of limiting pressures on the expenditure side. It means limiting contingent liabilities by adequately regulating banks, avoiding recapitalization costs, strengthening the governance of SOEs. It means further developing financial markets where financial markets are underdeveloped, where a diverse population of local investors in debt securities is absent, given the tendency of international investors to cut and run. It means embracing those legal and procedural challenges I described earlier that can streamline and speed restructuring for countries whose debts are unsustainable. So that is modest medicine, given the severity of the illness, if you will. It doesn't make for a happy diagnosis, but I would argue it makes for a realistic one. In my remaining time, I would like to spend a few minutes talking about two specific countries on which we don't, in fact, focus in the paper. The first of them will not surprise you. It's my country, the United States. The rise in U.S. Federal government debt in the hands of the public to roughly 100% of GDP is a well-known fact. Less well-known is that the response to COVID and the March 2021 Biden stimulus had relatively little to do with this. So the next slide shows you the evolution of the debt ratio in the United States, federal debt held by the public together with Congressional Budget Office projections. So I grabbed the slide from the Economic Strategy Group. It reproduced the CBO's nonpartisan CBO's projections of debt going out for the next 3 decades that I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. And I have circled here the response to and the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis, because it's there where public debt has jumped up most significantly, and not so much immediately before the vertical line toward the right of the figure, which is the response to COVID. Why did debt jump up during and following the global financial crisis? Answer: because spending remained elevated and revenues remained depressed for the better part of a decade due to slow growth during the 2010s, the well-known phenomenon of slow productivity and output growth for a decade after the GFC, and the fact that the 2017 Trump corporate tax cuts and other measures caused revenues to remain depressed for much of that subsequent period. So again, I can show you, without the circled period, the CBO's projections going forward, the question obviously is, should we believe what any economist says about the evolution of public debt going out as long as 3 decades into the future? The first thing to remind ourselves of is that the CBO's mandate requires it to project the evolution of the federal government debt, assuming no changes in current law, that laws governing spending and taxation alike remain unchanged over the forecasting period here as long as 3 decades. So underlying these forecasts is the assumption of no changes in current law, assumptions about other things like population aging and healthcare expenses. We know that demographic variables evolve very gradually. They are relatively easy to forecast. There is no reason to particularly quibble with this forecast of the share of US populations 65 years and older, unless you imagine dramatic changes, dramatic liberalization, in particular of US immigration law, which I'm not inclined to imagine. On the other hand, the projections that I showed you a moment ago in this figure are driven even more heavily by assumptions about spending, and in particular, the big one here, which is assumptions about changes in the percentage of GDP devoted to healthcare spending. So we know that the share of GDP devoted to healthcare spending and the relative cost of healthcare services has been trending up in the United States until recently, when it has stopped trending up. So I would submit that there is a lot of uncertainty about what will happen to healthcare costs, both what the cost of the relevant technologies will be and how they will be delivered. We don't really fully understand the drivers of healthcare costs in the United States, and we certainly don't understand why the behavior of this variable has changed so dramatically in the last couple of years. So that is a big uncertainty about what will happen going forward. So I am more inclined to the view that the US debt outlook is uncertain than I am inclined to the view that we have a big catastrophe necessarily looming. The other country I want to mention before closing is, wait for it, this one probably is not one you would have anticipated, Jamaica. My focus on it is a happy consequence of what happens when you do conference or webinar presentations. So our Jackson Hole paper presentation included a short list of emerging markets and advanced countries that had succeeded in achieving significant fiscal consolidation. One member of the audience, Peter Henry, now at Stanford, asked, what about my country of birth, Jamaica? Well, Jamaica is not classified as an emerging market according to the IMF and the leading commercial index makers. But you can see from the next figure that in the course of the last 10 years, it has achieved rather remarkable debt reduction. It's reduced its government debt to GDP ratio from on the order of 150% of GDP to on the order of 75%, 70 to 75% of GDP. And it has done so without resorting to an involuntary debt restructuring. So it did voluntary debt exchanges where it pushed some of the debt service out into the future. It accepted higher interest rates in return for longer maturities in 2010 and 2013. But that was basic, and it did a little bit of other clever financial engineering, but it basically reduced its debt the old-fashioned way, the hard way, by running large primary surpluses over extended periods of time. I know this because after Peter made that comment, Serkan and I teamed up with Peter and were in the process of writing a paper on Jamaica now, which is how did Jamaica do it exactly, and do the lessons of the country generalize to what other economies might they generalize? So at a superficial level, as I've said, what has been going on is no mystery. Jamaica has been running large primary budget surpluses since 2013 or so, as you can see from the figure. It has cut its debt to GDP ratio by 75 percentage points, despite having rather anemic economic growth on the order of 1.5% per annum over that period. So I think that makes the outcome all the more extraordinary. Jamaica still pays a relatively high interest rate. So it's despite inflation, its growth rate, interest rate differential is neutral to unfavorable. As I show you here, that figure I passed over was decomposition of the change in the debt ratio into various components, and it's the dark blue component that's relevant here. There are the primary surpluses, large in the past, with the sole exception of the first COVID year, and extending into the future, according to current forecasts of the government and the IMF. And here is that interest rate, real growth rate differential, which is not driving the debt reduction in Jamaica either. And Jamaica did a couple of additional good things. It avoided a banking and financial crisis. It actually went through an earlier period of debt consolidation when the debt was even higher, and it initially succeeded in reducing that debt quite substantially until it liberalized bank regulation and its financial markets in the 1990s and succumbed to a massive banking crisis in 1996. And that threw the earlier episode of debt consolidation off course. It avoided a financial crisis this time around, which is one of the factors that allowed fiscal consolidation to continue. And it kept the exchange rate relatively stable. It kept it from depreciating excessively, which was important because all of Jamaica's external debt is denominated in dollars. I should now say was denominated in dollars, because Jamaica finally was able to issue an international bond denominated in its own currency 2 months ago in November, after much preparation. But it's not as if it had domestic debt that it could freely inflate away. Significant portion of that domestic debt was held by the banks. So again, not restructuring and not inflating away the value was important for financial stability. So to cut to the chase, how did Jamaica do it? It was able to maintain these substantial primary budget surpluses over a decade and longer through the operation of two mechanisms or institutions. First, clear fiscal rules and strong fiscal institutions. And second, consultative and monitoring arrangements that made for consensus that reassured all parties that the burden of consolidation would be widely and fairly shared, and that everybody was keeping to the terms of the bargain. So when there was a change in government in 2016, the new government, in contrast to pretty much the entirety of Jamaica's prior history as an independent nation, the new government maintained the economic policies and the fiscal stance of the prior government. So what were these fiscal rules and institutions. In 2010, Jamaica introduced a fiscal responsibility framework that increased the transparency of the budgeting process, and it specified, this will sound familiar to our European audience, a target for the debt to GDP ratio of 60%. That law was then augmented and strengthened in 2014 by a requirement that the government specify a multi-year path for fiscal policy and a strategy. It would articulate how that path would bring the debt to GDP ratio down to its target of 60%, initially by year 2026, pushed back by 2 years now because of COVID. So there were escape clauses built into this target and fiscal rule that I would argue enhanced its credibility. Rigid rule that the government promises not to violate under any and all circumstances lacks the flexibility and credibility that the real world requires. But there were also independent agencies at the beginning, the IMF, and later an independent fiscal council in the Jamaican context called the Fiscal Commission to monitor fiscal policy and the government's adherence to the specified path, to verify independently that the kind of event specified by the escape clause had actually occurred, in effect checking and providing a second opinion on the government's fiscal plans. Favorable political conditions facilitated adoption of these fiscal institutions. So again, I think I have the varieties of democracy. I don't. The varieties of democracy database would show you that its measure of political polarization in Jamaica was declining in the run-up to and during this period. That declining polarization was what made for the policy continuity that I described before, when for the first time in 40 years, the new party on taking office did not reverse the policies of its predecessor. And I would argue that this decline in political polarization was facilitated by the creation of new consultative institutions. So this is a long story, but the key time was 2013, when Jamaica created an Economic Program Oversight Committee, EPOC, if you will, made up of representatives of the private sector, the public sector, and civil society, through which government, the financial community, and the unions could monitor the economic program, engage in dialogue and consensus building, such that the burden of adjustment is widely shared. So EPOC has a website. It publishes the conclusions with regard to the conduct of fiscal policy of its members quarterly. As a result, I think of this consensus building and monitoring process. Budgeting didn't change, as I've said, when government passed from one of the two major parties to the other in 2016. The organized process of consultation created a sense of fair burden sharing. It sustained public support for the operation of the fiscal rule and the country's fiscal institutions. Do the lessons generalize? The IMF apparently thinks so. So the managing director made a speech a couple of years ago plotting Jamaica's exit from its IMF program and suggesting that other countries should do, institutionally speaking, what Jamaica have done. So far, we have identified and analyzed 3 countries that have achieved significant fiscal consolidation by, we would argue, adopting and exploiting analogous arrangements. Fiscal transparency, fiscal rules, and consultative arrangements a la Jamaica. The three analogous cases are Ireland in the late 1980s, Iceland following the global financial crisis, and Barbados today. So you will have already noted that these are all small economies. These are all islands. These are all countries with ethnically homogeneous populations. So I don't think island status is the key variable here, but I suspect that small size and ethnically homogeneous populations are related to the sustainability of this, what political scientists would call neo-corporatist approach to consensus building, where the social partners and the private and the public sector get together and agree on burden sharing. So this suggests that the approach taken in Jamaica can also be taken in at least in other countries where there are a limited number of agents and where cooperation is not overly complicated by ethnic divisions. But the observation also suggests that this approach may be harder for large, ethnically diverse economies like mine, for example. So on that note, let me stop, and I'm happy to hear reactions, take comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Barry. Very interesting talk. We already have a couple of questions in the chat, but let me try to convince people to hop on. You have to raise your hand, and then you can actually ask your question directly to Barry, which I think is a bit more interactive. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and then you can join in. I hope this works. If not, if there's nobody hopping in right now, then I would start by reading Daniel Hardy's question, which I think is a very good one. How worried should we be about the effects of aging populations? As people age, presumably they save less or dissave. The reduction in demand for government securities will need to be offset by higher yields. So the small young cohorts will have an incentive to save more.
Yeah, I think population aging is one of the main factors to which the World Bank points when it forecasts slower growth over the next decade compared to the last in developing countries and emerging markets. You only have to say the word China in order to understand where they're coming from, and that's hard to argue with. One can, however, argue about the life cycle model of saving and question whether, for example, Chinese savings rates, which are notoriously high, will come down as the population continues to age, on the assumption that old people dissave while young people are saving, and there will be more dissavers than there will be savers. The empirical evidence for the life cycle model, as many people on this call will know, is at best mixed. Is there really dissaving of the sort assumed in the model by the older, or do they maintain their cushion of wealth as they and are they interested in bequests as they continue to age? So this is an interesting set of issues for all of us to think about.
Great.
I see another question there. If you're not going to ask it,
Yeah, I
Christoph.
think we have three hands up here by now.
All right.
So I overlooked them. So let's start with Royal Bitsma. I think
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot. I thought this was very interesting, and especially the example that you gave of Jamaica, which managed to reduce the public debt by 75 percentage points. And I was wondering, I'm a member of the European Fiscal Board, and we are, of course, dealing with these issues, advising the Commission on the fiscal rules. So I'm wondering whether you can draw any lessons for EU countries that need to reduce the public debt. That's one. The second is you were talking about ethnic divisions, maybe, or absence of ethnic divisions. Probably that is a supporting factor to reduce the public debt. But when I look at my own country, the Netherlands, we have a lot of political division, many parties in 4 parties in government, many parties in parliament, and we've seen public deficits go up quite dramatically. So I'm not sure that ethnic divisions is the only factor, but also political dispersion may be a very important other factor. Thank you very much.
I certainly agree. My co-author and I in the paper looked at the structure of the political system as a potential factor in ability of countries to maintain a coalition supportive of primary surpluses and debt reduction. And much as I am enamored of the view that proportional representation is important for political outcomes, and I actually and have done some work on that going all the way back to my 1992 book, we were not able to find support for those measures of the structure of the electoral system, majoritarian, proportional, etc., as a factor explaining differential success across countries. So topic for further research, if you will. And on the European point, I'm you will understand that I'm in an uncomfortable position here. I have not been a fan historically of the EU's 60% debt to GDP target, and have long questioned the realism of that target and whether having it imposed on national legislatures from the outside, if you will, is a viable strategy or not. But here I have a story about how exactly the same target seems to have worked constructively in the Jamaican case, even though it doesn't exactly have a lustrous history in the EU context. So, the target has to be owned, is the story we tell about Jamaica, in order to work. And there is a fundamental tension there in the context of the European Union.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. Next was Taman Aslanuma, who had his hand up before. Taman, why didn't you come in?
Thanks, Christoph. And also, Barry, thanks so much for the nice presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes,
You can hear? Okay, great. So this is Taman speaking. I mean, Happy New Year for everyone. Barry, I have two questions. The first is going to be, what would be the policy options? Speaking about your general message that we can see for advanced economy, the emerging countries, low-income countries, what would be coordinated, or any possible coordinated approach could help in order to minimize the debt over the world? That's the first question, which is more a little bit bigger conceptual question. What could the policymaker could potentially do? Second question, speaking about my countries, which is actually similar to the case, which is ethnically we have more unified. However, like politicians relatively have so short-sighted. They only care about, when crisis happen, we actually spend more. Then after the crisis, we don't do the consolidation as much. How could change the mind of politicians to be more long-sighted, thinking about long-term benefits of reducing the debt over time, thinking about more the younger generations in order to serve the debt? So that's my two questions.
So on the second question, Tamon, I don't know which country is your country, and the way you
Sorry,
described it.
I'm thinking about Japan. Sorry, I mentioned Japan. So that's the, we have a high debt of more than like close to 300% of GDP, which is after the COVID, we're struggling. We actually try to spend more. So that going to not in the same magnitude with the US but actually going to the same magnitude of the European countries you see.
The reason I couldn't identify your country is you described it as one where policymakers don't take a long-term view, which could be any country, of course. I live by Simon Kuznets's dictum. He used to start his courses on economic growth. There are four kinds of countries in the world: developed, developing, Argentina, and Japan, and that's still true. I don't understand Japan. I think that it's important to recognize that the Japanese government has lots of assets as well as lots of debt. I think it will be important for the Japanese government not to do anything precipitously that excites the bond markets. So that's why I think the BOJ has been prudent by moving very, very slowly toward the point where it may begin to normalize the level of interest rates. But I should leave it there. Japan is clearly a prime case where we can see how countries can live with high public debts for an extended period of time if those debts are, especially if those debts are denominated in their own currency. Living with those high debts is not a happy condition, other things equal, but I think that's life, and that speaks to my answer to your first question, that I do not think that there is a magic bullet here where there's not going to be a debt jubilee. There's not going to be international agreement on writing down these high public debts, because not all governments agree on the desirability of doing so, and the creditors who would stand to lose money on such an operation are a powerful lobby. So, the conclusion of the paper, and we came in for some criticism of Jackson Hole for not either issuing a more dire warning or suggesting some magic mechanism that could bring these high debts down, is that the best we can do is avoid making a bad situation worse.
Great. So I think the next person was Miranda Xafa. I will give preference to those raising their hands. So those in the chat, if they want to come out, or like Rayon or anybody, please come ahead, or Lorenzo. But Miranda, the floor is yours.
You have not mentioned the privatization revenue as one possible source of debt reduction. It has helped in my own country, Greece, which reduced its debt ratio from more than 200% of GDP in 2020 to about 165 now. This was not the main factor. The main factor was unanticipated inflation in 2022 and the rapid recovery from COVID. But privatization revenue also played a role. It's not going to help your country, but it can help countries like Argentina and other emerging markets.
Yeah, that's a good point. I may have skipped over it because it was not a major factor in the Jamaican case that I've been thinking about recently. What they did was to strengthen the governance of SOEs, which had been a big factor in the previous period, adding to the budget deficit. So they had losses in public transportation, the provision of electricity and water and things like that, and they avoided having those losses recur during the period of consolidation. They didn't privatize, but you're quite right that a variety of other countries, and you've mentioned two really good cases, could make some progress along those lines.
Thank you. Robert Farago. Please.
I was interested to know how do you think about the role of crises in solving these things? Because you mentioned Ireland, Iceland, and clearly that I don't know much about Barbados and Jamaica, but that was clearly a big trigger for them adjusting their policies. And when I think back to Hall of Mirrors, I think in the US also that crisis is a big impetus for policy change. So that's my first question. Everyone seems to be asking two, so I'll ask two as well. You've talked about, I find your argument on financial repression quite convincing, but your talk at Jackson Hole was chaired by, or co-hosted by Carmen Reinhardt, and I'd be interested if she agrees with you or if she challenged your view. Thank you.
So on the second point, Carmen provided thoughtful comments on the paper. She did not address the scope for financial repression going forward. Maybe because I preempted her by saying not everybody will agree with this point about the lack of scope for financial repression, but maybe Carmen's co-author can speak to this issue. Crises. I go back to Simon Kuznets, 4 kinds of countries in the world. Argentina is a reminder that crisis puts you on a path toward fiscal consolidation, except when it doesn't. But there are a variety of cases where crisis is the trigger. Miranda has reminded us of another one already. But there has to be a constructive response to the crisis, and I tried to suggest in the Jamaican illustration, for example, what kind of arrangements can facilitate a constructive response.
But do you think in the US we need that sort of crisis to get the political cohesion to get a change in policy, or can we have a change in policy without a crisis?
Ask me after the 2024 elections. Seriously, it's hard to understand or forecast what will happen in terms of political polarization and the ability of the two parties to work together on a sustainable fiscal plan on which they can both agree. At the moment, it's impossible to imagine, but at the moment, things are moving in the wrong direction, but who knows?
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I would have many questions and comments, but I will not. I will have the privilege to others here. He's the moderator, so and co-author of Carmen, of course. But let me hand over to Creon Butler.
Thanks very much. At the end of your fascinating example on Jamaica, you sort of hinted that this was a new kind of corporatism that had been put in place to create the consensus. I just wondered to what extent you think that can coexist with what we've come to assume are really important features of macroeconomic management, like independent central banks, competition authorities, fiscal transparency bodies, and so on, because kind of old style corporatism wouldn't have had any space for those things. So is it actually something that you add on to those bits of our macroeconomic framework and sort of coexists with them, and then it's a sort of combined effect that produces this consensus?
Yeah, I think it is the combined effect. So the Jamaican case is one with a independent fiscal commission and independent central bank currently, but also with these consultative institutions where everybody has input into fiscal decision making, and the outcome hopefully is a sense of fair burden sharing. So that's the addition, if you will, to the standard institutional recipe. And I thought it was, when I went back and realized that the IMF in 2019 had trumpeted this as well. You know, the IMF believes in independent central banks and fiscal transparency and independent fiscal councils, but it also recognized the importance in the Jamaican case of this additional set of institutions.
Great. We're already over time, so I will pick three final people from the list at the risk of discriminating, but we have a problem of over demand here on questions. So let me pick Mark Bolund, Vicky Price, and Emil Werner. Mark, why don't you go first, Mark Bolund?
Hi, sorry. Yeah, my question is, I mean, the case of Jamaica is taken up quite oftenly. I've also seen an FT Alphaville. So I'm not an expert on the case, but I mean, how relevant is it for other emerging and frontier markets, this kind of debt reduction? And also, I understand with external creditors how our domestic debt restructuring over an external debt restructuring is preferred, but from a kind of a political economy perspective, how relevant is this for other emerging markets?
How representative or relevant is Jamaica? You know, we started to look at it, as I said before, because it seemed to be a dramatic counterexample relative to my own personal intellectual baseline. And after looking at it, I made the case, I'm making the case that Jamaica is relevant to a range of other relatively small, ethnically homogeneous economies, heavily indebted economies. And its relevance is that it shows that debt reduction is possible when you put the relevant institutions in place. How widely will its experience be replicated? Who knows? But that, you know, it's a case study, and that's why we do case studies in addition to global analyses and global comparisons. Remind me, your other question was?
No, that was the only question for me. Thank you.
Great. Vicky Price, why don't you come in?
So, hi. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. But thank you very much for this. You mentioned, Barry, to quite a considerable extent, you majored on the US and the issues there, and of course you also concluded that advanced nations can carry on having large debt to GDP ratios because basically everyone wants their bonds, private and also from developing countries as well, to hold them because they're safer. Well, what's happening in the US, of course, is that you've got this great complication of the debt ceiling, which has resulted in a downgrade of the US by a number of credit rating agencies. Do you think that that is a permanent issue? And because they can't find any solution to this, I think that's one of the reasons why they quoted the debt ceiling as one of the main factors for this downgrade. Do you think that that is a restrictive thing on US policymakers, and therefore is going to weigh against the US for quite some time to come?
I think it's an unfortunate restriction in that the Congress passes and the president signs laws requiring certain kinds of spending or taxation, and then it has this additional law that requires taxes and tax spending net of taxes not to exceed a certain level. So the debt ceiling has been pushed out to after the 2024 election. It won't come back until then. one of the three rating agencies last time I looked had modestly downgraded U.S. credit. So I think our politicians will continue to use it as a lever to try to extract policy concessions from their opponents, especially those politicians who want downsized government at any cost. And we've got a substantial number of the latter in the Congress. It's hard to forge a sustained political consensus around debt consolidation when some of the people you're negotiating don't have debt consolidation as a priority. They have gutting the government as a priority. And that's what these debt ceiling deadlocks are about when they come around.
Thank you.
Thanks. So last question goes to Emil Werner. Hope still here. Yeah, please join in.
Hi, yes. Thank you very much, Barry, for the very interesting presentation. I also wanted to ask a question about the US. It seems like, these CBO projections of rising debt to GDP are, of course, very alarming under current law. And so it says something will probably have to give. And it seems like given the R-G solution is not going to work, inflation is not going to work, is what you're saying, financial repression, we can't go back to that. So that makes me think, one scope which might be politically difficult, but that the US has, is to raise taxes, given that the US is one of the relatively less taxed countries in the world, in the OECD. Now, I'm not suggesting going to sort of France levels, but what do you think about the scope for actually raising tax revenues in the US?
That is the answer I give when forced to answer, that the US is a lightly taxed country by advanced country standards. So that's a margin on which we can act. If you look at the federal government budget, the majority of it, in a sense, is entitlements. And many of those entitlements, like Social Security, are not means tested. Not exactly clear why I should be receiving Social Security benefits, given that I'm reasonably well off. But so far, raising taxes and means testing entitlements remains toxic in the United States. But if I ran the country, I think that's where I would look first.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Great, Barry. That's a wonderful ending. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. We look forward to more work coming and to the next couple of webinars. Yeah, everybody a nice remainder of the day, and thanks so much again to Barry.
Thank you, Christoph, and everyone.